little bit of fire, a little bit of ice, a little bit of muscle, a little roll of dice, a little bit of carrot, a little bit of stick, a little bit of burn on, a little bit of wick, a little bit of thinking, and y'all take my advice. You need a little bit of fire and a little bit of ice. Well, once I met a young man who couldn't get out of bed, ain't got no use for living, that's just the words he said. Well, I've spoken to my doctor, spoken to my shrink, I've turned to evil women, I've turned to drugs and drink.
Hello, welcome to episode 4. We are right in the core of the argument for the existence of God, revolving around this, of course, the scientific issue of origin of life. Just a brief reminder, if to gain the full benefits from these presentations, I would advise it's worthwhile to watch them in order. They're really designed that way. One builds on the other. So, right now, we find ourselves needing to clarify exactly why is it that we know, with the same certainty that we know 2 + 2 = 4, that every single watch in existence was made by a watchmaker. We demonstrated clearly in episode 3 that it is not from experience. As a matter of fact, this notion that we know that all watches are made by watchmakers is from experience is one of the great philosophical blunders in the history of human intellectual inquiry. So, how then do we know? And the answer is really quite simple. It is not based on experience alone. In light of the totality of human experience and observation, we have formulated and extracted a principle/law that has been tested and applied so many times that it has the same status as any of the fundamental laws of science, of the laws of physics, of the laws of chemistry. Before I can explain to you what this principle law is that we have formulated and extracted, I need to explain 2 terms to you. The first term is functional complexity. Functional complexity simply means taking a lot of different parts, putting them together in a very specific way in order to perform a very specific purpose. Taking the parts of a watch, putting them together in a very specific way in order to build an instrument that tells time. That watch would then be an example of functional complexity, as opposed to non-functional complexity. If I have a pile of scrap metal in a junkyard, one could say that pile of scrap metal is complex inasmuch as there is no simple algorithm that can explain how the pieces of metal are sitting on one another. However, despite that, it is clearly nothing more than a functionless pile of junk. It doesn't perform any function at all. If I would take those metal parts and put them together to form an Abrams battle tank, that would be an example of functional complexity. The second term is specified information. Specified information simply means taking any symbols that are available to us, putting them together in a certain way, in a specific way, in order to convey significant and coherent information. The symbols could be the English alphabet. The symbols could be the Hebrew alphabet. They could be dots and dashes in a Morse code. They could be smoke signals. They could be drum beats. It doesn't matter what the symbols that you use are. The point is that you use them in order to convey specific, coherent, significant information. All language, essentially, is specified information. Now, with those terms clarified, we can state what this law/principle is. There are certain levels of functional complexity and specified information above and beyond which the human mind simply refuses to accept could have been the product of an unguided random process. Above and beyond these levels, we simply take for granted as an indisputable truth that there is a conscious, creative force behind these phenomena. It is obvious that suits, poems, and watches are well beyond this threshold level. Therefore, we conclude with absolute certainty that every single watch in existence has been formed by a watchmaker. not just based on our experience, but based on the principle/law that we have formulated based on our experience. And if we take it a step further, it becomes rather obvious why this law becomes an absolute indisputable truth with the same level of clarity as the laws of science. And that is because this law, this observation that we have formulated, is nothing more than an outcome, an illustration, or reflection of the most fundamental laws of physics and mathematical probability. I don't want you to take my word for it. I'm going to let a world-renowned atheistic physicist explain it for you, make my case for me, I should say. And by the way, this is the path that I take in the book and in all my presentations. I don't use people who agree with me in order to support my case. I only cite people who disagree with me to make my case. That is the strongest type of argument you can make when even those who oppose you, when you use the words of those who oppose you in order to show that your thesis is correct. The physicist that we're talking about is Dr. Leonard Susskind, a theoretical physicist at Stanford University, a nice Jewish boy from New York. And he wrote a book. The title is a great title. That's what caught my eye. He wrote a book called The Black Hole War: My Battle with Stephen Hawking to Make the World Safe for Quantum Mechanics. That is quite a title. And this explains exactly the idea that we're talking about. Quote, "It would be a bad idea to park your BMW in the rainforest for 500 years. When you came back, you'd find a pile of rust. If you left the pile of rust for another 500 years, you could be pretty sure it wouldn't turn back into a working BMW. That, in short, is the second law of thermodynamics. Both the BMW and the rust heap are collections of about 10 to the 28 atoms, mostly iron. Imagine that you took these atoms and threw them together randomly. What is the likelihood that they would come together to form a working automobile, meaning a functionally complex machine? I think we can all agree it would be extremely unlikely. If you imagined all the possible ways that you could assemble the atoms, the overwhelming majority would look like rust heaps. If you shook up the atoms of a car, you would be much more likely to get a pile of rust because there are so many more rust pile arrangements than car arrangements." End of quote. For those of you who aren't clear, 10 to the 28, by the way, is 10 multiplied by itself 28 times, or a 1 followed by 28 zeros. That is an enormous amount of atoms. The second law of thermodynamics, if you're not familiar, is one of the most fundamental laws in all of scientific inquiry. In other words, the unguided natural forces of the rainforest acting upon these atoms is no different than randomly shaking them, because these unguided forces have no particular purpose in mind. If we subjected the atoms or parts of a watch to unguided natural forces, we would end up with a meaningless pile of junk. That is because there are so many more junk pile arrangements than working watch arrangements. And that is why we are absolutely certain that every watch in existence is assembled not by unguided forces, but by a conscious creative force called a watchmaker. And every single suit in existence is created by a conscious creative force called a tailor, and all BMWs are put together on assembly lines. Now, Dr. Susskind then goes on to explain how these laws of physics and mathematical probability apply equally well to specified information, such as the poem we mentioned earlier. Quote, "Here is another example. An ape banging away at a typewriter will almost always type gibberish. Very rarely will he type a grammatically correct sentence. What's more, if you take the letters of a meaningful sentence and shake them up like tiles in a Scrabble game, the result will almost always be gibberish. The reason? there are a lot more nonsensical ways to arrange 20 or 30 letters than there are meaningful ones. End of quote. And if you're unclear, if you're not sure about that, sit down at your computer keyboard and start typing away randomly and watch what appears on the screen, and you will understand it very, very clearly. And by the way, at this point, now we understand why Richard Dawkins reframed and renamed the argument from design the argument from improbability. Because the argument from design is really essentially nothing more than an argument from astoundingly absurd probability based on the laws of physics, the most fundamental laws of physics, and mathematical probability. Well, at this point, we're now ready to discuss things in the living world. The type of complexity that we see in the living world is quantum leaps beyond anything we've talked about so far. There are endless examples. For instance, billions and billions of organisms have in their chest cavity an astoundingly efficient electric pump. We call it a heart, but that's all it is an electric pump. If you would subject the parts or atoms of a heart to unguided natural forces, you'd end up with a pile of goo. Well, it would seem reasonable then, at least at first glance, to assume that living organisms are also assembled by a conscious, creative force based on this argument from design, argument from probability, based on the laws of physics and mathematical probability. And guess what? Even the atheists agree. All of them agree. So what happens? Why don't they join us? Stay tuned for episode 5. We're going to explain that next. Take care. Thanks for listening. God bless you.
Well, a little bit of fire, a little bit of ice, a little bit of muscle, a little roll of dice, and a little bit of carrot, a little bit of stick, a little bit of burn, and on a little bit of wick, a little bit of thinking, and y'all take my advice. You need a little bit of fire and a little bit of ice. Well, once I met a young man who couldn't get out of bed, ain't got no use for living, that's just the words he said. Well, I've spoken to my doctor, spoken to my shrink. I've turned to evil women, I've turned to drugs and drink. I've turned to every cure that's known to mankind. Now, I lie in bed and dream about when I was a child. Everything was so peaceful and nice. I said, son, you need a little bit of fire and a little bit of ice. Well, a little bit of fire, little bit of ice, little bit of muscle, a little rolling dice, and a little bit of carrot, a little bit of stick, a little bit of burn on, a little bit of wick, a little bit of thinking, and your heart, take my advice. You need a little bit of fire and a little bit of ice. Well, I met a secretary at the word processing screen. She never gets no overtime, but boss is really mean. At the family Thanksgiving dinner, she felt so all alone. She wanted to be back working, now she wants to be back home. She's putting on her running shoes to catch the evening train. Now she dreams about where her next vacation might be. How Jamaica would be nice. I said, sister, you need a little bit of fire and a little bit of ice. Take a trip to Washington, D.C. Senate and Congress all waiting there for me. Gonna step up to that microphone, gonna tell it to them straight.